Hey, good evening, everyone. It's Steve Outhouse here from Right Recruiter. Glad you could join us tonight. Sorry if I look a little bit boxy on the screen. As I'm learning, we have some. There's always a technical issue to worry about when we do webinars, and tonight broadcasting from my phone as opposed to my computer. So we're really glad that you're here, and thanks for joining us at Right Recruiter. And for those who this may be your first time, the whole vision of Right Recruiter is really to kind of create this conservative talent network from across the country and to help conservatives win campaigns, and then more importantly, I guess, be really good at governing so that we can continue to win elections and deserve that re-election. It's a platform that we hope is going to start to create an opportunity for people who are looking to get into politics and looking to become political staffers, to put their resumes forward, and for different political offices, ministers' offices, campaigns to start posting jobs and to connect with conservatives across the country who are looking to get more engaged and involved professionally. And we're very fortunate to have amazing conservative talent who've been willing to invest their time. We had MP Eric Duncan join us a couple weeks ago, and we have another guest is coming up in about another couple weeks, which I'll talk about at the end of our webinar this evening. But with us tonight is just someone who I have so much respect for. I put in my social media post that she's one of the smartest people I know. That is not hyperbole. That is not just me blowing smoke. Rachel Curran is a lawyer by training with nearly 15 years of experience providing strategic and policy advice to the Prime Minister of Canada and federal and provincial cabinet ministers. She's worked as a senior associate with Harper and Associates Limited and as an instructor at Carleton University's Riddell Program in Political Management. She's also appeared as a regular panelist on CBC's Power and Politics and always did a great job there. And she was commenting, obviously, on issues of the day, policy and politics. And Rachel is currently head of public policy for Meta Canada. So I know that means she's very, very busy, and really appreciate you taking the time today to be with us, Rachel. I wanted to add to that in addition to all the smarts side of things, you are you're a person of integrity who I think would be hard pressed to find someone to speak an ill word of you kind of after a time in politics. That is no small feat. And I can say that Rachel chairs a great meeting as well. I had the chance when we were in government to sit at the table a few times, at the policy meetings, and she can crack the whip, but in a respectful way that keeps people focused. So, Rachel, thanks for being here with us this evening.
Thanks so much, Steve. And, I will try and live up to that billing. You are far too kind. So I think maybe half of that is actually true, but thank you for saying it all. And I am recording it for future reference.
I'll put it on your LinkedIn profile later. But we could all aim to just for about half of that to be true, and it would be great. So look, thanks for being here tonight. And I'm going to dive in and start just throwing some questions out at you. But just to say to everyone that we'll be taking questions from the conversation or from the chat that's there. And so I have enough that we could kind of go the whole time, but we want to make sure that people find value in this. So if you have questions for Rachel about policy and politics and how they combine and connect, please drop them in the chat and we'll grab some of those as we go. So Rachel, the first question I'd like to ask sort of everyone when they get on one of these webinars is, how did you become a political staffer? What's your story and how did that come about?
Yeah, Steve, honestly, completely by accident. I had virtually no hand in it and could never have planned it, as is often the case, I think, with anyone's career progression. And it's interesting because younger people often ask in particular, like, how do you plan this career trajectory? Truthfully, it's almost impossible to plan it. So I was just extremely kind of fortunate and blessed to get the opportunities I did. But I started off as a relatively junior staffer, an executive, what was called an executive assistant in the BC provincial government. And the EA, that role involved a little bit of comms, a little bit of policy, a little bit of issues management, really whatever the minister required. Provincial offices, as some of your listeners might know, are considerably smaller than federal political offices. And so at that point, I think we had about 3 staff in the minister's office in British Columbia. So I got to do a little bit of everything, but I was definitely the junior person in that office. And honestly, the way I got there, I was practicing law in Vancouver at the time, and I was pretty tired of the current NDP government. And so when a guy called Gordon Campbell decided to run for office and head up the BC Liberals, I assisted with that campaign a little bit in a very minor way. And then I was invited to come work at the legislature in Victoria as a result of that work. And so I ended up, working in one of his minister's offices and kind of falling in love with public policy. So that's how I got my start in politics, and it was truly accidental. I thought I would be, a commercial litigator for most of my career, and in fact, I ended up doing that for about 3 years before getting into politics and never leaving.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. And I think it's encouraging to a lot of people, especially sort of the younger potential staffers are out there, because when they see someone like yourself who's on TV and being a spokesperson and has gotten up to the highest ranks of the PMO, it's good to remember that every one of us started at a more junior level, and there's no one right way to get into this line of work. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, 100%. And I should say,
Yeah.
Steve, for your audience too, if you start off as a relatively junior political staffer, chances are, because as you know, Steve, there's so much turnover
Yeah.
in political staffing, you will move up very quickly. So you may start off as a junior person for 6 months, maybe a year. You are almost certain to move up into a senior role if you're in an office or in kind of the political world for any longer than a year or two. So the opportunities to move up quickly are pretty significant.
Yeah, definitely. There is a lot of churn in the political world for sure. Now, kind of moving into your specialty of policy, although I mean, obviously you have strengths in other areas as well, but policy is where we're going to be focusing our conversation tonight. So some people might say that policy is not as important as it once was, or it's not important these days, that it doesn't win elections, it's comms, it's social media, it's other intangibles, leadership style, etc. What's your take on that? And what role do you think policy plays in electing governments, and then I guess looking down the road a little bit and keeping them elected?
Yeah, I don't think it plays a very big role at all in getting leaders or governments elected. And I know that seems odd to say because I've worked on many, many platforms and put like hours and hours of my life into getting policy proposals in electoral platforms like perfect,
Mm.
perfectly written, perfectly costed. And of course, at least in the campaigns I've worked on, the policy platforms have been robust. They've been detailed. They've been, a real kind of heavy lift in terms of preparation. But I'm not sure that policy per se has ever, Steve, been a very important factor in getting someone elected. And I'm happy to debate that issue. I think people vote not with their minds, but with their hearts, and they vote on emotional reaction to leaders more than anything. However, I do think policy can help get you unelected.
Mm.
And if you don't govern well, and I'll refrain from going into specifics in an attempt not to be too partisan. But look, the Harper government for which I worked made some policy mistakes too. I think if you do make policy errors, they can certainly pave the path to your exit from government.
Mm.
So policy becomes very important in government, particularly if you don't do it well. So there's a lot of policy work that happens behind the scenes that Canadians never see. It's sort of thankless and unsung. But if you screw it up, it can go a long way towards shifting your electoral fortunes pretty significantly in the next election. So I think it's important from that perspective. Also, I should say, so why prepare a platform at all? Like, why not just run on a one-page pamphlet? The Federal Civil Service in particular is quite good. In fact, they're very good at taking a party's policy platform and turning it into mandate letters to ministers as soon as a government enters office. So literally, the week after, a government transitions into office, the civil service will have drafted mandate letters with platform commitments in those letters and separated them out by minister. So, without that, you're sort of directionless. And I can tell you, if you don't have a policy platform and you leave it up to the civil service to draft the mandate letters, it will be full of things that aren't your government's priorities. So I think it's pretty essential to have a detailed policy platform, if for no other reason than if you're successful. And if you end up in government, it's going to guide the work that your ministers do.
Mhm. There's a lot to unpack in there. I want to come back to mandate letters, and I want to come back to working with the public service. But I want to remind folks, if they have questions for Rachel, to drop them in the chat, and we're happy to put those forward. But sticking just with like the staffer perspective for one more moment, which is sort of the main thrust of Right Recruiter, is what are the typical traits that you see of a successful policy advisor or director of policy within a government context? What are you've seen a lot of people probably come and go from these types of positions. Are there kind of traits or common threads that you've seen through them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, look, analytical skills and the ability to write well and to communicate well and clearly and succinctly are essential. So when you're a policy advisor, you're briefing, ministers or prime ministers either in writing or orally or both. So an ability to deliver your message and your recommendation very clearly and very succinctly, because they have a lot of information coming at them, is critical. Also, I should say, political policy staffers, the reason I love the job is you're operating at the nexus of policy and politics. And the best policy solution is not necessarily the best political solution, and vice versa. So your advice has to balance political factors and policy factors and figure out what the right balance is between those two things. So you need great kind of policy judgment, but you also need great political judgment, and you need to be able to overlay politics on policy. So, if you're going to the prime minister with just the best policy solution, you're probably replicating what the civil service is already doing. Your value add as a political staffer is in overlaying political considerations and applying those to the same policy file and making a recommendation from there. So it's a very different function and different exercise, and good analytical skills are critical, but so is good political judgment.
Just on a very practical level, then, I mean, if someone comes in, and I know this happens when government gets elected. I remember when the Harper government was first elected, I remember thinking, wow, this is really exciting. Maybe I should put my resume forward. And I thought, oh no, they've just won the election. They must have all the people they need to run the government. And that's when I realized later on, I mean, there's like 20 odd ministers' offices with anywhere between 4 and 20 staffers in them, and PMO and the research bureau and all these things. But some people just come in because, wow, they want to work for the attorney general, or they want to work for the minister of natural resources because it's something they're passionate about.
Yeah.
How do they keep that political acumen sharp, or how do they keep that skill honed while you're sitting in there dealing with the bureaucracy day after day in a minister's office, or a premier's office, or PMO? How do you keep that political side sharp?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, the longer governments are in office, the longer they kind of get, sort of fat and lazy about that kind of thing. And truly kind of keeping your political skills and political judgment sharp can be a real challenge. I will say for the Harper government, because we were in a minority government for the first 2 terms, it was a bit easier, because when you're in a minority context, you're running sort of a parallel campaign prep exercise alongside governing, because you could be in an election at any moment. So it's a bit easier to think politically, because literally you could be on the campaign trail the next day if you lose a confidence vote. When you're in a majority government, that becomes much harder. You tend to get sort of sucked into the world of governing and the nitty gritty of kind of government policy files, and you forget that your job as a political staffer, your primary job, is to make sure that your boss and your government are reelected. And obviously, you're not just doing that for the sake of hanging on to power. It's because you actually think that the vision your party has, your leader has for, governing the country or the future of the country is the right one. So you've got to keep your eye on that ball and never forget that your kind of number one job is to make sure that your boss doesn't lose his job.
Yeah.
So that's, that's the sort of perspective you always have to have as a political staffer. But to be honest, Steve, like over the years, especially in a majority government, it gets harder and harder to maintain that perspective, and it's a real challenge for political staff.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. By the end of, you can kind of see it near the end of a government. It's a tough slog. We're going to go to our first question from the chat now. Connor had one here. Connor Lund. What is the experience of drafting platforms as a government looking for re-election versus party in opposition? Or what's your experience in that, and maybe what are some of the differences that you've seen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are pros and cons, right? So if you're a government looking for re-election, nobody ever says this, but you've got all of the resources of government at your disposal. And you can do things like, float a proposal for inclusion in a government budget, and have the civil service do all of the policy work and the costing work to put that proposal together, and then decide it's not going to be in your government budget, but it might be in your next platform for re-election. And so I think you'll see governments who are campaigning for re-election will, I mean, you're not supposed to use the resources of government. I think informally, sometimes that's not the case. And you take proposals that have been worked up by the civil service or other minister's office that haven't moved forward during your time in government, and they become sometimes nice platform items. On the other hand, if you're a government campaigning for re-election, you're held to a much higher standard. Like, if the media or other stakeholders are looking at your policy platform, they're going to expect your costing to be perfect. They're going to expect, because you're the government, that all of your policy proposals make real sense and are able to be implemented in a kind of, realistic governing context. That's not true of the opposition. You have far more leeway just to, propose things that the government might know are never workable in reality. But because you're the opposition, you kind of get some leeway to propose things like that. And your response to the government's allegation that, this would never be workable, in fact, is to say, well, if we were in government, we would make it work, right? Yep. So you get much more leeway on that. You also get much more leeway on sort of costing details and some of the things that media and others just expect governments to have a better handle on. So there are pros and cons. I'm not going to say one is an easier job than the other, but I think I would prefer to be drafting a platform in opposition, to be honest.
Interesting. Yeah. That's great. All right. Thanks, Connor, for that. Fellow Nova Scotian. So I trusted it would be a good question. We are going to go to another question from the group in just a moment, but I do want to just do a quick follow-up before you put Fred's question up there. When you talked about just the importance of the platform overall and costing and so on, how important is that now, you think? Like, I think... So this is just my general impression of it, where it used to be, like the media would be much more interested in sort of the costing and so on, and maybe even the general public. I don't know if it has the same sort of oomph that it used to, but what's your observation on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, just as kind of, society has become less interested in substantive things and substantive discussion. The same is true for policy platforms. Like, they've become sort of increasingly not irrelevant, but just less interesting to media and to voters over the course of the campaign. But again, I'm not convinced they were ever that compelling as a reason to vote in favor of someone. But I do think that, media and others used to apply more scrutiny to policy platforms and cover them in more detail and more substance, for sure. So I think that's true. I just don't think they were ever very determinative.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, sorry, Fred. I took your question came up and I dropped it back. I understand it's about media attacks. It says, how much does the fear of media attack then affect policy? Like, I guess when you're sitting there and you're coming up with the intersection of politics and policy and what the right way to go is, how much factoring in do we need to do of what the media are going to write about this or that?
Yeah, I think if you're a good political staffer, you're always going to be thinking about communications. So this is where, now look, certain governments are driven more by communications concerns than others, for sure. Others are more policy focused. But political staffers should always be taking into account how a policy proposal is going to be covered by the media, how it's going to be received by Canadians. As policy advisors in the Harper PMO, we used to work very closely. We'd have like an assigned communications staff person who would work alongside us, an assigned issues management staff person who would work alongside us. And so you were always doing a holistic assessment of every policy file. You can't ignore communications. You can't ignore how the media is going to receive or cover something. Obviously, there are a lot more channels now for getting your message out directly to voters, through social media, through your own kind of YouTube channel. So you can bypass the media now in a way you couldn't before, but you still have to think about how to communicate what you're doing and whether it's going to resonate. And often when you're looking at policy options, if you've got a great policy option that's difficult to impossible to communicate, and a less great policy option that's still adequate, but it's much easier to communicate, if you're a good political staffer, you're probably going to recommend the one that your government can sell and that isn't going to alienate voters, or that won't be attacked by the media. So it's always a factor.
Interesting. Okay. So thanks, Fred. Appreciate that. Great to see your name there on the screen. I want to go back because you mentioned mandate letters, and this is something now, it seems like there's a trend where all the mandate letters, kind of at multiple levels of government now, are just public documents. When I started in government, they weren't. They were things that, Frank, we held them close to our chest and didn't talk a lot about them. But what... if kind of one of our potential staffers here is watching tonight, jumps into a minister's office at some point in time, what's sort of the breakdown between how much of the policy work that they're doing would relate to, say, a centrally given mandate letter versus ministerial-led initiatives or ideas that are kind of coming forward from the bureaucracy? Is there a general percentage, or does it vary? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on the minister's office.
Right.
Again, a good minister's office and good political staff will make sure that the majority of the time they are focused on their mandate letter items, because that's the direction coming from the PM and from the center. And you want to make sure you've ticked off most of those while your minister is still in his or her portfolio. Now, if you're a weaker minister's office, or, do
we have those?
I know, hard to imagine.
Yeah. In theory, okay. In theory, if a weaker minister's office existed, okay, tell us what would they do?
In theory, yes. If you have a minister who is easily swayed, by priorities that the civil service brings forward, that balance can shift, and the minister may end up bringing things to cabinet that are not in his or her mandate letter. I can tell you that that minister will certainly hear about it from the Prime Minister if they get to the 6-month or 1-year mark and none of the mandate letter items have progressed, but the minister has brought forward a number of other initiatives to cabinet. So part of the job of a chief of staff, of a director of policy, even of a director of communications or parliamentary affairs, is to make sure the minister is focused and the department is focused on checking off those mandate letter items. And truthfully, in fairness to the civil service, as I say, they're very much oriented towards getting those done. The Privy Council office will put those items in platform items in a mandate letter. They will hold departments to account for moving those initiatives forward and bringing them to cabinet as many times as necessary. So the system is oriented around moving those forward, but political staff also have to make sure that the minister and the department are focused on them.
Now I got to follow up before we go to our next one from the chat. So I'd like to kind of just delve into that a little bit about ideas that are coming forward from the public service, and I'll confess that one of my earlier minister's offices I worked in, so we were pretty good at getting our mandate items checked. But there was an initiative that came forward from the public service about a piece of legislation that needed to be modernized, and stakeholders are begging for it, the industry wants it, everyone was in agreement, and consultation has happened, and we were like, well, this sounds like the most, this is perfect, why wouldn't we want to do this? Well, as soon as we introduced the legislation, I tell you immediately we found out that their idea of consultation was perhaps different than what we had heard, and interpretations might have been a bit anyway, there was a lot of I don't know, generous interpretations of what industry really wanted and so on, and ultimately it did not pass the muster, but it was a painful path to get there. What sort of advice do you have for people who are getting into the policy field when an idea comes just sort of out of the blue from your department? What are some questions you should ask? What are some red or yellow flags that you should put up? What are some things that you should do to make sure that you're not about to send your minister down a bad path?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I was going to ask, did you bring forward a proposal to shut down all the lighthouses in Canada or something?
No, no.
It's always something like that, right? It's lighthouses, it's the RCMP musical ride, it's the snowbirds. No, we don't really need any of these things. And of course, that may be true, but it's also tremendously unpopular. So I would say the ideas that come from the civil service often are not bad ideas at all. Sometimes they're even good ideas or necessary ideas, but you really have to apply your political judgment to them and do your own political outreach and stakeholder work. So, often when you're talking about platform proposals, hopefully a lot of that work has been done already by whoever drafted the platform. It's gone through caucus, it's gone through the eyes of kind of multiple people in political leadership positions who've done the vetting. But if you get a proposal out of the blue from the civil service, you have to remember that none of that political groundwork has been done. So you've basically got to, if you're going to proceed with it, if you truly think it's a good idea, make sure you go through all of those steps first. Right. Before you proceed with it. And as I say, some of these things are not terrible ideas, migrating everyone to a common email address, for instance. I mean, not a terrible idea. You can spend a ton of time and a ton of money getting that done, and it's not going to help you in the end be reelected, right? And arguably, it's not something you would have wanted to prioritize, if you found yourself in government. So you have to remember, 4 years seems like a long time. If you have a majority mandate, if it's a minority, it's even shorter than that. It passes extremely quickly. So you have to be super, super focused on the things that you truly think are political priorities and that you've been elected to accomplish. And all of these things, which are maybe good ideas, need to be run through that filter. It's do we have the bandwidth to do this? Do we have the time? Is this going to contribute to our reelection, or at least not contribute to our non-reelection?
Yeah, unelected.
So you've got to do that political work right from scratch, which has already been done for most platform proposals.
Excellent. Thanks. We're about at our halfway mark. And just a reminder, if you want to keep dropping questions in the chat, our next one's from Cross, who says, or who asks, what influenced your decision to depart from political administration, and what sector do you find is more fulfilling, private or political?
Great question. So, I mean, look, I didn't choose to depart politics.
Fair
We
enough.
lost an election in 2015, and I
Ooh.
was literally like the person who turned out the lights in the PMO, the former Langevin building.
Were you really?
November of yes, yeah, as we
No.
handed over the keys to the incoming Trudeau administration. So I went right to the bitter end. I wouldn't advise other political staffers to necessarily follow that path.
Mm,
In fact, whenever I'm asked, I'm like, get out before you lose an election, because it's
yeah.
much easier, to find a job after that. So that's just a word of advice to your
Mm,
listeners. Um, look, what's more fulfilling? I mean, they're both really interesting in different ways. If you are oriented towards public service, I think politics is always going to be more fulfilling in that sense. I mean, one of the great things about where I am currently is that some of the issues I'm working on do have kind of broad public impact. And so I can sort of squeeze in public service that way. But if you are public service oriented, and I am, then politics is always going to be probably more meaningful than private sector work.
hmm Yeah, first of all, good advice on the depart when the leaving is good. As much as it frustrated me, I will say I'm very much a stay to the end person. So like you, I was with then Minister Polyev in his office, and was annoyed at seeing folks around town leaving for various reasons, and everyone saying, "Of course, we believe that you guys have got this, and we're with you." And
Yeah, yeah,
they were
yeah.
going off and getting good jobs, and then all of a sudden there were about, I don't know, hundreds of us all looking for work at the same time. But anyway, I will probably always be a turn out the lights person, as opposed to leaving when things are advantageous. That's just how I am
A
wired.
100%. Yeah, like if you're very attached to your leader or your minister, it's almost impossible to leave. I get
Yeah.
that. I wanted to stay with Mr. Harper right to the bitter end too, but there is a cost associated with that political staff should be aware of.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So we touched on the public service angle of this, and you've had experience at both the provincial and federal levels. Can you give some tips on how to work constructively and productively with the public service?
Yeah. Look, I had a fantastic experience in British Columbia because the bureaucracy is so much smaller there. There just aren't the same like multiple layers of management. And so I would literally be working very directly with, the assistant deputy ministers or directors in charge of particular files. And we had a fantastic working relationship. Like if they needed a quick decision from the minister's office, they would just pick up the phone and call me. And if I needed information, I would pick up the phone and call them, and it was fantastic. Now, at the federal level, I found it a bit more difficult simply because there were so many layers of like management, and the sort of structures
Mm,
of authority were much more rigid. So, for instance, now look, I had again a really good relationship with lots of folks in the Privy Council office, which is the Prime Minister's department. So the civil service equivalent to the Prime Minister's office, and they were our points of contact on files, and there were some super smart, fantastic people in there. One thing I found frustrating was the inability to call directly into departments
mm,
to get information on a particular file. So we had to go through the clerk of the Privy Council or our contact person in the Privy Council office in order to talk to anyone in another department. And of course, the point of contact in the other department, even for the Privy Council office, was like the deputy minister. And so the person who actually knew anything about the file was like way down in the bowels of the bureaucracy.
right.
And they would report up through like 3 different levels to the deputy minister, who would then report to the Privy Council office, who would then report to us. And there were so many layers in there that it's just the information you got in the end was often useless.
Mm.
So one way we got around this was to set up these structures called four corners meetings.
Oh, I remember those.
Yes, Steve, these were like a great innovation. So we would set up meetings with the four corners were PMO, PCO, the minister's office, and the minister's department and departmental officials, and getting all of those offices in the same room so they could talk directly to one another was like a great way of kind of bypassing a lot of this bureaucratic red tape. But I think, how do you work well with the civil service? Well, I think you just respect. First of all, treat people respectfully. Like,
Yeah.
don't be a jerk. Which political staff can often be tempted to do because you're in these positions of considerable power.
Mhm.
And the temptation is to assume that you're entitled to be there and you should exercise your authority in a not very pleasant way over other people. I can tell you that's
Mm.
the absolute wrong way to get anything done. So treating the civil service respectfully and also respecting that they have a particular job to do that's different from yours. So they're not necessarily going to be 100% on board with what you want to do because it's not their job to be 100% on board. It is their job to provide a challenge function and to provide good policy advice. And you should absolutely insist on that. But they do have a very different job, and there's supposed to be some tension between the roles. So I think it's okay to have that tension, but just you have to keep it from translating into kind of personal attacks or personal animus,
Mhm.
because you will get nothing done. Political staff will get nothing done without the bureaucracy assisting them. And if you develop a reputation as someone who's difficult to work with, then you probably really won't get anything done.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Yeah, because they can outweight you.
yeah,
They know that at some point in time, ministers and governments they move on, and some folks stay in some of those departments for a long
yeah,
time. I remember my staffer story. I came from within the public service, and so I was there when the Liberals lost to Prime Minister Harper and the Conservatives.
yeah,
And at that point in time, the Liberals still had the system where it was a bit of a revolving door, and people from ministers' offices got priority placement in the public service. And I got to hear the conversations because I had yet been, I ended up like going up to help the new minister for quote 2 weeks, and now here we are, whatever, 15 years later, and I'm still doing this. But
yeah.
they discussions where people were saying, well, should we bring this person in, and then people saying no, like, working with them was a nightmare, we do not want them on our team. And you're right, it's very easy to get drunk on power. You got to remember that they only care about you because of how close your desk is to the person who's making the ultimate decision. And I think it
100%.
was good for me to know that going into my first political role.
100%, Steve. Like, none of these roles are merit-based.
Mm.
It's a tremendous privilege to occupy these positions. Most of us have gotten there entirely by accident. It's
Mm.
not that we're better or smarter or harder working than, the other 99.9% of Canadians who would love to be in those jobs. So just like keep some perspective there and,
Yeah.
remember that A, it's a privilege. B, you're only there for a very short time. And when your government loses an election or you screw up and get fired, hopefully you don't end up on the front page of the Globe and Mail.
Yeah.
But when you're out, nobody's going to be sending you emails. Nobody's going to care what you
Yep.
say or think. So just remember there is a life after politics, and prepare for that life.
Yeah.
Not the role you occupy
Yeah.
presently.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit trail, but I will say someone approached me the other day, a former staffer I work with, who actually proposed sharing like, kind of her story about leaving government and sort of the adjustment that was. And I know I left kind of in the middle and then came back, and yeah, like people unfriended me from Facebook and everything because I was like I had no more practical implications for their life. Anyway, we're moving into a different topic. I do have a question coming from Jeremy in just a moment here in the chat, but I did want to kind of you talked about the four corners and bringing together. Now, I remember sometimes those four corners would turn into like 6 or 8, corners and so on, as multiple ministers' offices would be implicated. If you've got a situation where you've got two ministers' offices, they're just in a standoff, and I mean, you've got two ministries that are sort of going in different directions. They have different agendas. They have different mandates. They're looking out for different groups of stakeholders. So a government decision can affect them, differently. If your role is in the middle of that to try to mediate and bring things together, what type of criteria or hierarchy of, how do you make the decision about who needs to kind of to triumph in the end?
Yeah, so the 6 corners meetings or 8 corners or, however many
Yeah.
corners you have are one good way to resolve those conflicts. So if you can get both ministers' offices and the Privy Council office as kind of a go-between or mediator in the same room, that's one good way of resolving a conflict and getting both offices at least to, a middle position that both can support.
Mhm.
The other way that we utilized, which worked because Mr. Harper was just very good at kind of churning through piles and piles of paper and making decisions, was to get both ministers to write in with their positions, their respective positions. Those letters would go up to the Prime Minister with a covering note from the Privy Council office, just indicating, look, Minister A has a different position on this than Minister B. Here's what we think. Privy Council office would weigh in with their view. That would be covered with a political note from the Prime Minister's office, from one of the policy advisors, who would say, look, we think Minister A's solution is better, or we think some combination of these two is the best solution. And we get the Prime Minister to write out his decision. Once that's in writing and signed by him, it's implemented through the system. So that's another quick way for us of resolving conflict, was just to do it through a letter format.
Excellent. Great idea. All right, we're going to take a couple from the chat now. Let's go to Jeremy's question. Jeremy says, what does the actual day of a policy staffer, advisor, director, whatever, look like? And what sort of tasks and meetings are in an average daily schedule?
Yeah, it's also a really good question. I mean, these days, I will say I did not regret leaving the PMO because the lifestyle was just not very
Balanced.
not very balanced. Yeah, there wasn't much of a life outside of work, I should say. So if you're a policy advisor in the PMO, your day is just spent writing memos to the Prime Minister. And some of the advisors would write up to 3, 4, 5 memos a day. You're often responding to a note from the Privy Council office on a particular topic. I had divided up the advisors by policy area. So energy and environment, you'd be writing notes on those issues. Foreign policy, you'd be covering all of the foreign and trade issues. And so advisors would be writing notes in their kind of respective areas for much of the day. The turnaround time had to be super quick. You have to churn those notes out often in less than 24 hours with your best advice. Also, there'd be a lot of meetings with stakeholder groups. So, one of the advantages of being in the PMO is that everyone will come to you. Same is true in a minister's office. So, every group in the land, every stakeholder group in the land, from business groups to cultural groups to charities to, you name it, wants to come and meet with you and present their perspective on a particular issue or advocate for particular policy change. So you've got to dedicate at least a good part of the week to meeting with those groups also, and either committing to move their ideas forward, getting their feedback on policy proposals that you're looking into. So there's a lot of stakeholder work too. And then, a good chunk of your day is also dealing with other ministers' offices. If you're in the Prime Minister's office. So if you're the energy and environment policy advisor, you're talking to the department, the minister's office in environment, in natural resources, like you're dealing with those offices and their priorities and making sure that their ministers are on track to deliver what they have said they'll deliver. Managing any new proposals that might come out of those offices. So it's a lot of kind of internal management as well of people and ministers. So that's like a policy advisor's day. If you're the director of policy, you're managing and overseeing all of that work. And so you've got to know a little bit about every file, like kind of 2 inches deep. And on some kind of key files, you have to go a lot deeper than that. But you've got to sort of coordinate the whole exercise. And you're also running the cabinet schedules. So you're making sure that what's scheduled for cabinet is the things that need to be considered as priorities, that the civil service isn't bringing forward, things that aren't necessarily priorities, and that the most important things for your government are getting into cabinet quickly and being implemented quickly. So you're monitoring kind of the cabinet and policy schedule across government as well.
Thanks for that question, Jeremy. We're going to go to Fred's next question in just a moment, but I'd just like to just pick out something that you talked about, a difference between being the advisor and the director. And I think a lot of people are under the assumption that it's just sort of like the smartest policy advisor becomes the director of policy, or the best media person becomes the director of communications. But there's a different skill set that goes into the director level at this, that I think I've seen some people jump into those roles thinking that, this is what I really want, and then finding out there's a lot of extra things at the director level that they don't necessarily want. Can you maybe just quickly touch on that? Like, when you move into a director role, what are some things all of a sudden you've got to think about? Despite being, you can be the most brilliant policy mind out there, you're the director of policy. What are some extra things that are all of a sudden on your plate?
Yeah, I have to say, like, it's a totally different skill set and a totally different job description. Like, I loved being a policy advisor and writing memos to the Prime Minister and kind of thinking through my advice and getting really deep into policy files. And once I was the director, I could no longer do that. And I really, really missed that. So I spent far less time writing. In fact, I, wrote very few memos at that point. It was really just people management and kind of organization management and schedule management of cabinet, and making sure the Prime Minister had the briefing materials he needed and that his cabinet binders were complete, and harassing people to produce products, when those binders weren't complete. So, it is a totally different job. And it's the job of a manager, like a system manager, a schedule manager, a people manager. And if I had to choose, to be honest, I preferred the role of a policy advisor, because you're much more focused on policy instead of management of policy. So it's something to remember when you're in a director level role. Like, you may not get the time to do the stuff that you love to do nearly as frequently.
Yeah. And vacation schedules, coordinating and telling who's off at Christmas time and who's not.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Look, I had a tremendously amazing team. And they weren't difficult to manage because they were all wonderful. But people management is pretty thankless. Like, if anyone has done HR, people have all kinds of different issues that some of which you can anticipate, others you would never have anticipated, and it takes a lot of time. You would know this, Steve, like, you spend much of your day in conversations with people about HR issues. And certainly the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff estimated that he spent about 30 to 35% of his day on HR.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Fred. I know we're in our final few moments here. Fred had another question. It says, what about seeking to do the right thing? Politicking seems to be supreme. And I know Fred's a great guy, and he gives a lot of thought to kind of the policy and the right thing to do. So how do you balance that of, maybe the most pure conservative thing that we want to do versus, what needs to be done sometimes? How would you balance that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Canada, we're tremendously lucky that almost everyone is there to do what, in their view, is the right thing. We all have different ideas on what the right approach is. The parties have very different ideas on what the right
Mm.
approach is to a particular policy issue. But by and large, everyone in the system, and I would say that for people in other parties too, they're there for the right reasons. They're there to do the right thing because they think their agenda is the best one for the country. But look, there's no point proceeding with a particular policy solution that is going to be overturned within a year or two, or that's going to get you tossed out of office. If you want to implement lasting change, you've got to stay in power for a while. And that means thinking about political factors too. And politics like shouldn't be a dirty word, right? It means thinking about what Canadians actually want. Like you've got to be responsive to what the broader population wants, not just the people who voted for you. And if you aren't responsive to that, your political career is going to be pretty short, and any change that you manage to implement is going to be very quickly overturned. So yeah, I agree. You want to do the right thing, but you also want the right thing to last for a while. So you've got to consider politics.
Yeah. Just rapid fire for just their final, a couple here as we're going into the home stretch. As a policy advisor, what are some of the inputs that you like to see when you're making decision? If it's an economic decision, are there certain types of, data? And I realize, of course, everything will be dependent on what issue, whether it's a social issue, economic issue, but are there things that you found most helpful that you would encourage potential new staffers to either ask their public service for, or certain types of data sets or information?
Yeah, well, this is where the public service, like this is the real strength of a public service. It's hard. Now, some policy staff are really good at analyzing economic data that comes out of, the Bank of Canada or the OECD or various other sources of economic data. But really, that's where staffers can really lean on the civil service. They've got economists, kind of expert analysts, data analysts in the system who can get you, what you need and what you're looking for if you've got a productive working relationship with them. So decisions absolutely should be data driven. And the civil service, by and large, if you ask for specific data, they're pretty good at providing it.
Mhm. Excellent.
I also
Are
have a
there,
lot of time,
oh
by
yeah,
the way,
go.
the parliamentary budget officer.
Oh yeah.
So, they've gotten into the business of costing platform proposals, which I
Yeah.
actually think is very helpful too.
Mm.
They've got, lengthy economic backgrounds, and can do really great economic and fiscal analysis, often very quickly. So
Mm.
they're a great resource too.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. Any pearls of wisdom you want to toss out there to kind of conservative-minded staffers or potential staffers? Sometimes you're working with a public service that might be, a little less conservative than we are. Is there just ways that you can approach issues, or language you can use, or just ways to frame issues that kind of puts everyone more at ease and working together?
I would just say this, like it's as with every other area of endeavor, it's all about relationships. And the relationships you develop in politics and with the civil service are what is going to kind of sustain you through your time as a political staffer. And then after you've left your job as a political staffer as well, which I think a lot of political staff need to spend more time thinking about. So it really does come down to the quality of your relationships. And I think that's true in every career. It's how people kind of move up in their careers. It's how they get recognized. It's how they get promoted. It's how they move into senior positions. It's because they've developed a strong network and strong relationships. And so I like always be thinking about that and develop strong relationships, not just with people in your own political tribe and the civil service, but also people, on the other side of the fence. Those are also going to serve you well, not just when you're in politics, but when you're out too.
Great. Look, I think that's a great place to leave it. So, Rachel, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're an incredibly busy person, and for you to clear this time out of your schedule to talk to potential future staffers or just people who are interested in the policy world and helping the Conservative movement be stronger across Canada, we really do appreciate it. And I want to just make sure everyone knows that you will be getting a recording of the webinar. And I know just for future ones too, just because someone asked me this question the other day, if you register for it, if you're interested in the topic but you're not able to tune in kind of in real time, if you register, you will get the link at the end with the recording so that you can watch it at a later date. I'd mentioned that we do have our next guest confirmed, so 2 weeks from tonight on August 3rd at 6 p.m. Mountain or 8 o'clock Eastern. Marshall Smith, who is the Chief of Staff for Premier Danielle Smith in Alberta, is going to be joining us, and we want to make sure we hear from provincial Conservatives as well. So we're really glad to have Marshall kind of sharing a little bit of he'll get more in depth on the provincial side of things, and Marshall's just a great guy, and we'll have a lot of interesting stories to share. So that's going to be August 3rd if you want to mark your calendars, and there'll be we'll start to promote that there. So Rachel, just back to you for a moment. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, take care. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks to everyone for joining us at our webinar tonight with Right Recruiter. Take care.